Mr. York that you can see today, the advertising mannequin, he was created in 1928 to take to shows, to show to the public. Rowntree's at the time realised that consumers needed to engage emotionally with the product. This was the new science of marketing. The man who's really credited with starting off this marketing revolution is George Harris. Up until that point, we had all kinds of lines of chocolate bars and boxes of chocolates, and they were all named after members of the royal family, royal palaces. It was really getting a little bit silly, and it was George Harris that said, let's give all of our products strong identities. Things like Kit Kat instead of chocolate crisp, and Smarties instead of just chocolate beans. They wanted people to feel a real connection with their chocolate bar, and one of the best ways to do that was to create a character, a mascot, like Mr. York. Well, first of all, plain Mr. York advertised York plain chocolate, so it was chocolate without milk. But it was also plain speaking and plain dealing and an honest Yorkshireman, because that's what Yorkshiremen were famous for. That's why he's called Plain Mr. York of York Yorks, the plain speaking man who likes plain chocolate. Mr. York, the cartoon, was created in 1926 by the famous cartoonist Alfred Leet. So he was the gentleman who drew the Kitchener posters, you know, the Your Country Needs You. And most famously, in 1929, he appeared in the first ever moving picture advertisement with sound in the world.
Why, of course, if he could only talk, he'd tell you so. He could only talk. I'll make him talk.
The cinema advertisement was 7 minutes long, which is very, very long for a cinema advertisement. In those days, you were used to seeing static slides of just one picture that would be projected onto the screen, advertising a particular product or chocolate. But this was 7 minutes of live action with some real people in a real street, and then some people in a studio, and then a cartoon, and then back to live action in the studio again. It's really very unusual for its time.
Emily, York milk, Emily. Oh, 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 oh! Don't forget to take some home.
Mr. York was one of the biggest international celebrities of the 1920s and early 1930s. He was incredibly popular because he appeared on posters everywhere, not just in a cinema advertisement. He was so popular that people would dress up as him for fancy dress parties and have their photograph taken and post it into the factory. And we've got some letters that were posted to us that were simply addressed to Plain Mr. York of York Yorks. And they arrived here at the factory with only that address. He was that famous. There's a really great photograph of a man in Canada who's dressed up as Mr. York to go and visit some orphans. And there's a sea of orphans looking up adoringly at this man on a stagecoach dressed as Mr. York. Eventually, Mr. York became so famous that you didn't even need to see his face to know that someone was talking about him. You would just see the hat and his spectacles, and that was the sign of Mr. York. And there's a really great photograph of lots of people from York and from Rowntree's going off to see York playing in the Cup final, I think it was. And they've hired a train, and on the front of the train, they've put a big round disc with Mr. York's hat and Mr. York's glasses so that everybody knows where those football fans have come from. Well, when I first got the job here looking after the company archives, I heard rumours that there was this advertising robot somewhere that people referred to as Mr. Rowntree. And I did some investigating, and I found out what he looked like and when he'd last been seen. And I went round trying to find out where he'd gone. And then one day I discovered that he was in our Croydon offices, around the back of the reception area in a dark corner. I thought that Mr. York of York Yorks shouldn't be resting in Croydon. So my colleague and I hired a van, and we went down to Croydon late one evening, and the facilities department were very kind, and they arranged to build us a coffin for Mr. York so we could transfer him safely. Mr. York, he's a very interesting robot. He's worked by a very old gramophone motor, and it moves his eyebrows and his eyeballs, which are glass, very scary. And it moves his bottom lip, and he's trying to smile and show you his teeth, but he's got rather old, so he can't do that so much anymore. And he used to have a tray of leaflets or postcards of himself just over one arm, and he has a sucker with a pump inside his right hand that picks up leaflets or postcards, and then he would pass them out to his adoring fans. Well, I was working late one evening in one of the cupboards that we were using for an archive, and Mr. York was in a corner, and he'd only just been brought back to York, so I hadn't realised that if you switch him off in the wrong position, his springs wind down, and all of a sudden, hours after you've switched him off, he'll move very dramatically. And he did that late one night, and his hand brushed against my hair. I got the fright of my life, and I went screaming out of the room and off down to the security guard saying, "He's moving, he's moving." Mr. York and I are friends now. I think I've forgiven him for frightening me. But it's so nice that he can be here somewhere where so many people can see him. So he's not shut away in a cupboard, but he's here for everybody in York to enjoy.